Hello, welcome to Comic Tropes. I'm your host, Chris. Today, I'm going to talk to you about an entire genre of manga, an important bit of its history, but to get there, I'm going to take a bit of a circuitous route. So, you may have seen this movie I'm about to talk about, Midsummer. It came out in 2019. It was the second big mainstream release by director Ari Aster. It basically follows a cult, a commune, I guess you could say it in nicer terms, in Sweden. And there's a very memorable scene there where an elderly man jumps off of a cliff, a willing sacrifice to the commune. That elderly man was played by actor Bjorn Andersson. Now, as a teenager, Bjorn had starred in an Italian movie that would become hugely influential visually for manga. That's right, we're talking about a Swedish actor in an Italian film based on a novel by a German author that would inspire Japanese artists. Just an interesting bit of bringing in all sorts of worldly influences into one moment in time. That was just a visual influence, and we're going to get into how that bit of trivia fits into the history of shoujo manga. We're going to talk about some of its most important figures and some of its evolution, especially in the 1970s when it was its golden age, when it really became popular. Shoujo manga is aimed at teenage girls, but I really think this topic is going to be of interest to everybody. So, without any further ado, we should get into it. Bjorn Andersson was a 16-year-old actor who starred in director Luchino Visconti's 1971 film Death in Venice, based on the novel by Thomas Mann. Andersson plays Hagio, a young Polish boy visiting Venice with his family. The story follows composer Gustav, who is also visiting and whose health is failing him. He finds himself obsessed with the handsome young man Tadzio, but eventually dies of a heart attack while staring at Tadzio on the beach. Following the completion of the film, actor Andersson took an extended trip to Japan, where he appeared in some television commercials, print ads for things like Meiji chocolate, and recorded some pop music. His first ads began showing up in the fall of 1970, followed at the end of the year by the release of Death in Venice in Japan. The images of the effeminate boy, often in little sailor suits, captured the imagination of several Japanese manga artists, including Keiko Takemiya, who was inspired to create a new kind of manga. It would include androgynous boys, often exploring homosexual impulses, but with stories aimed at young girls, not emphasizing the sex, but rather the romance. Another important visual trope of shoujo manga is, of course, the large eyes of the protagonist. There are at least two big influences for that. One is artist Junichi Nakahara, who made dolls as a hobby and was inspired to capture the look of their eyes in his popular paintings. Another was the artwork of Osamu Tezuka, who himself was inspired by Western comics and animation like Betty Boop. The manga of post-World War II Japan was heavily influenced by the very popular work of Osamu Tezuka, including sci-fi stuff like Astro Boy, aimed at teenage boys. This is known as shonen manga. But in the 50s, Japan also began aiming manga stories at teenage girls, which is called shoujo manga. Early examples include Princess Onmitsu by Shosuke Kurakane. He made this manga a funny gag comic, which was typical for shoujo manga. In fact, most of the early shoujo manga was created by male creators. A lot of them were male creators that were hoping to eventually move to shonen manga. For instance, Tatsuya Chiba worked in shoujo manga, but became famous when he later transitioned to creating sports stories in shonen magazines. There were some early female pioneers, and we will mention them, but by and large, it was staffed by men at the time in the 50s. And these early stories were mostly funny, shallow gag manga, or maybe short stories based on etiquette. But over the following 2 decades, that would slowly change. Osamu Tezuka is known as the godfather of manga because of his incredible popularity, his innovation in creating new genres, and his workhorse ethic, pumping out tons of popular comic book stories. In 1953, an editor at Kodansha's girls' magazine Shōjo Club hired Tezuka to make a manga aimed at girls that would have the excitement and depth that his shonen manga featured. Tezuka created the story Princess Knight, which ran for the next 3 years. It was the story of Sapphire, a princess in a medieval kingdom born with 2 hearts, a blue boy's heart and a pink girl's heart. She was able to pose as a prince to prevent the kingdom from falling into the hands of the evil Duke Duralumin. The manga was a huge hit with readers. Shining Knight represented the first shoujo manga to move from simple gag humor strips and lessons about etiquette into a narrative story with a strong protagonist. It also featured a main character whose gender could be ambiguous. These were elements that would become established tropes in 1970s manga 2 decades later. Prior to the 1950s, Masako Watanabe had been a fine artist, but she transitioned to shoujo manga in the 50s after being inspired by Tezuka's work. She was noted for adding pastel colors to manga instead of simple primary colors. Hideko Mizuno broke into the industry in the 1950s by winning art competitions hosted by shoujo magazines and worked as an assistant for Tezuka. In the 60s, she had a lot of success with her manga White Troika, published in the pages of one of the most popular shoujo magazines, Margaret. Another early female pioneer in shoujo was Miyako Maki, who broke in when she discovered manga because her parents owned a book distribution company that exposed her to it. The thing all these pioneers had in common was the fact that they were definitely in the minority. It was just not considered a viable career path in the 1950s for women to go into creating manga. But the 1960s was a period of a lot of social change in Japan, and it would lead to the golden age of shoujo in the following decade. In 1964, artist Michiko Satonaka became a manga artist as a teenager in her 2nd year of high school. That same year, the Summer Olympics were held in Japan, and the country won the gold medal in women's volleyball. That in turn inspired the 1968 shoujo manga Attack No. 1, about a girls' volleyball team. That was a big success. These events together proved that being a manga artist was a viable career path for young women. In the early 1970s, a number of popular and influential female manga creators made their debuts in rapid succession. They would go on to be called, informally, the Year 24 Group. In context, the Year 24 Group is a broad and unspecific term that journalists and critics used to refer to the shoujo manga creators who were born around the same time, in the 24th year of Emperor Showa's reign, or as we'd know it, 1949. 2 important figures from this time that I want to discuss include Moto Hagio and Keiko Takemiya, who debuted in the manga field in 1969 and 1970, respectively. They even rented rooms in a row house together in Tokyo, which came to be called the Oizumi Salon, and was a place where many notable female manga creators would hang out and work. Each of the creators that I've mentioned and that I'm about to discuss further have produced a prodigious amount of manga, and many of them are still working today. But I'm really only breaking the surface. I'm really only giving you an overview and highlights of some of the important people that shaped this era of shoujo manga. What's important to note is that while the intended audience for this shoujo manga was young girls, the quality of what I'm discussing here is such that, similar to, say, a well-animated Pixar movie, while the intended audience may be younger or a different gender than you, that doesn't mean that other people can't appreciate good storytelling and good art. So let's continue to delve into it. Moto Hagio was inspired by Tezuka's manga Shinsengumi when she was about 17 and decided to become a manga creator. She debuted her first work, Lulu to Mimi, in the shoujo magazine Nakiyoshi. It was 1969 and she was only 20 years old. 2 years later, she created The November Gymnasium, about two boys at boarding school that fell in love. This was an early example of shonen ai, which translates to boy love, and which has evolved into subgenres like BL, boys love, and yaoi. From 1972 through 1976, Hagio published The Po Clan, beginning in Beisatsu Shoujo Comic, a monthly magazine. It follows three young vampires in Europe, non-chronologically, between the 18th and 21st centuries. This was an early example of the more complex stories shoujo began to tell, and it was a massive hit with readers. The story was romantic, tragic, and featured an ambiguously homoerotic relationship between two of its male leads. The book also resonated well with critics and won the Shogakukan Manga Award in 1975. It continues to be reprinted worldwide today. Keiko Takemiya debuted her story in The Sunroom in December of 1970 in the pages of Beisatsu Shoujo Comic, and it is regarded as the first shonen ai manga. That story follows a young gypsy boy named Serge who plays in an abandoned solarium. One day, a wealthy family buys the mansion, and thus, Serge is introduced to Étoile. The two fall in love, and the story ends with Étoile taking his own life when his parents discover their relationship. In 1976, Takemiya began an 8-year-long run on the story Kaze to Ki no Uta, about two young men who meet and fall in love at a French boarding school in the 19th century. You may notice that many of these stories are set in Europe, and that's because at the time, the Japanese did not acknowledge that their own people could be gay. So, any shonen ai stories were set in different times and places. These early examples of shonen ai with young men falling in love avoided any explicit sex and instead focused on the romance. They were progressive for their time. That said, they're certainly problematic today in some regards. For instance, they almost always end in tragedy, and there is a trope of abuse. That's a recurring element in a lot of these stories. But they were also well illustrated and much more complex and featured much more well-developed characters than what had been before. That ended up being very popular with readers and made shoujo manga incredibly popular in the 1970s and 1980s. And, by the way, Keiko was absolutely one of the artists influenced by those Japanese ads that I mentioned earlier that featured Bjorn Anderson. And beyond Bjorn visiting Japan, Keiko would visit Europe almost annually beginning in 1972 and moving forward. These creators and others didn't just get influenced, they were proactively influencing the industry. They were experimenting with panel layout that would sometimes do away with borders, and pushing the envelope with not just romance manga, but science fiction stories that they aimed at young readers. Another key example of this depth that these stories would achieve comes from 1978's two-issue story Claudine by Ryoko Ikeda, another member of the Year 24 group. This story follows Claude, a transgender man assigned female at birth. The story is set, as you can now guess, in early 20th century France. Claude falls in love with a ballet dancer, but she eventually leaves him for his brother. Believing his body is imperfect, Claude kills himself. Another story Ikeda told was Rose of Versailles, set against the backdrop of the French Revolution. All of these stories were being told by authors who were barely older than their target audience. That meant that they absolutely knew what their readers wanted. They wanted romance, they wanted danger, they wanted depth, and these things were being delivered. Also good artwork. So even if shoujo manga isn't necessarily something you consider your cup of tea, I think it's fascinating to look at this and see how many worldly influences were drawn in to create something new. It just sort of shows also how versatile comic books can be as a medium. They can tell almost any kind of story you can think of for any kind of an audience, and that's just impressive. If you are curious about exploring some of the better shoujo manga out there, I definitely think that, Osamu Tezuka's book, Princess Knight, is fairly seminal. But of the female creators, the ones that made an impact with me are Kazeto Ki no Uta, the Poe clan, and Claudine. That's why I mentioned those. I think that they're all interesting, but basically, if you're curious, look for 1970s manga, because most of it is period pieces anyway, so it hasn't really dated itself. It's some pretty interesting reading, I really promise you that. Anyway, hopefully this gives you a little bit of an overview and maybe gives you a little bit of trivia that you weren't familiar with before. Thanks so much for watching. I'm going to see you next week, and until then, keep reading comics. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please consider hitting like and subscribe. If you'd like to support the show, there are merchandise links beneath the YouTube video, and you can always hit join on YouTube or visit Comic Tropes on Patreon to get access to special perks.